Welcome back to Gardening with Creations by DX & Co. Today we're actually going to talk about a complete grower's guide to growing your own potatoes, from getting started to planting, different types of planting, whether that be container or in raised beds or in ground. And we're also going to talk about signs to look for when something's wrong and when it's ready to harvest. Let's get started. Alright, so what spurred this video on is, of course, like many of you, you may have forgotten about your potatoes actually on the counter or in your pantry, and they started sprouting these little eyes. So, of course, I have some, and we'll talk more about that just in a second. And I stumbled across this at our local Target store. It is a bucket, and it's specifically a potato grower bucket. Now, this particular bucket's not that large, but it is meant for growing potatoes. Now, I was going to do a video on this, and I probably still will, about how to DIY a version of this. You think this is just a simple bucket, but it's not. It actually separates in two. And it's so that way all the potatoes you can harvest very easily right out of the bucket without having to dump it out. Now, let's be honest, with a container gardening potatoes, it's easy just to dump them out, right? But this is still a really cool concept to be able to just lift this up, maybe harvest a potato or two, put it back together, and you can leave it, you know, for harvesting some of those smaller ones. So we're gonna go ahead and get probably 2 of these smaller potatoes planted in here. So let's first start by talking about the potato itself. So you can have a potato that's from your pantry or a seed potato, and they're going to look very similar to this. Now, as you can see here, this particular potato has already started growing what's called eyes. This is what they call chitting or chitting out, and that is where the actual eyes are sprouting on the potato. So if you ever hear the term chitting with potatoes, it just means that it's starting to sprout eyes. Now, if you want to you want a variety of potato that you have that you've liked and you want it to start chitting, then it's a great recommendation to do what I've done here, which is actually take an egg carton like this and put your potatoes in it and then put it in a warm, sunny location, and you will start to see that it'll start to sprout those eyes. And then when you start to see those eyes, you're ready for planting. Now, it is also true that you can actually plant a potato in the ground that doesn't have eyes on it, and it will still grow a potato plant. Now, the difference between that and this is just these are going to have a faster start because they've already grown those eyes and started. Sometimes you'll see one of these where it has, notice that my eyes are relatively short, but they can get very long on these, and that's okay too. Now, another thing you will notice with the potato, something similar to this one here, you will notice that I've got an eye on top and I've got some eyes on the side. I've got one here, couple there. Now, I can cut this potato up similar to this photo here, where you slice the potato and then you can make several potatoes out of that one. So you can either plant it whole, or you can cut it up and make several plants out of just that one potato. So if you have a lot of space and you have eyes growing out of your potato, it is okay. The one thing to remember is you need to let that fresh cut harden off for 24 to 48 hours, kind of scab over, as you can see here. Then it's okay to plant it. If you don't, it'll get prone to rot and disease, and nobody wants that, and you definitely don't want that. So I'm actually going to be planting my potatoes whole. I'm not going to be cutting them up, but you can absolutely cut it up to get more out of your potato. So what you need to get started. When planting a potato, you're looking for cool spring temps to get started. So you don't want to plant in the dead heat of summer. You absolutely don't want to plant in the cold winter either. So you're wanting the cool spring temps that really love that time of year to get started. Now your growing temps for potatoes, you actually want a range of, they like in between 50 and 70 degrees. Now we're talking Fahrenheit here. And that is the ideal temperature for growing potatoes. They do like a very light, fluffy soil because remember, they are a root crop. They grow tubers, right? So we'll talk more about that here in a minute. You're looking for a pH in your soil of anywhere between 5 and 6, but most varieties of potatoes will adapt. So you can go a little bit higher than that, but if you needed to, you could find some ways to reduce or lower your pH in your soil. Now, when you're planting your potatoes, whether you're doing container planting or you're doing a raised bed planting or you're doing in-ground, there are actually really 3 different style methods that I've come across for planting potatoes, and those are the 3 methods. Now, the raised bed and in-ground are going to be pretty much the same, but there's actually 2 different styles inside of that. So we're going to talk about container planting as I plant these out here, but let's talk a little bit about raised bed and or in-ground planting of your potatoes. What you want to do first is always start by digging about a 4 to 6 inch trench. So as you can see here in this photo, you want to dig a trench to plant your potatoes in. Now from there, once you've got them planted, you always want to plant them eye up, right? So this eye always pointing up, as you can see in the picture. And you want to make sure that you then kind of cover them up and mound them up, right? So as the potato actually pushes out of the ground, you now have, if you see any roots, you'll want to start backfilling and mounding over top of that, kind of backfill that dirt until the foliage or the leaves is enough to block out the sun. Now, there's another method of doing this as well, where a lot of people like to call it the lazy man's way of planting potatoes, which is perfectly fine. It works very well. What you do is you still dig that trench 4 to 6 inches deep, but you cover it with a strong mulch. So hay or straw is a great mulch to cover that up, just to keep that moist and keep it covered. And then as the potato starts to poke through, you backfill and fill more straw or mulch, or grass clippings is another great one. Wood chips does work, it's just not as good, in fact, as a hay or grass clippings. But you want to go and backfill it. That's what they call the lazy man's way of mounding, basically. It's less effort, same amount of reward. So once you've dug that trench, you fill it in, you cover it really nicely with a thick mulch, and then as the potatoes branch through, the actual potato leaves here branch through, you kind of fill it back up. You can see that here in this picture as well. Now, the last way of planting potatoes we're actually going to do today. So let me get my soil prepared and I'll show you what I'm doing. Planting your potatoes inside of containers is becoming more and more the preferred method by a lot of gardeners. There's multiple reasons for that, in fact. One, because you can move your containers around at any given time. So you can bring them in if you understand that there's going to be a potential frost that could damage your crop. Other reason is if a potato gets one of the diseases that we're going to talk about later on in this video, so stay tuned if you want to hear that. You can get rid of just that one container or that one plant without having to worry about it spreading to necessarily all of your plants. Perhaps one plant will be infested with potato bugs or something like that, and again, you can move that or deal with just that one plant, move it to another location in the garden and possibly save it. So that's one reason, being able to move or have mobile plant itself, right? The other reason is really the ease of harvesting. So at any given time, you can actually just dump this container out and get all of the potatoes and harvest them right then and there, versus digging up your garden and disturbing that soil and trying to get those potatoes out. Also remember that most of your potato varieties are a long haul. If you live in a shorter growing season climate like us here in 6A, we really only have from mid-April, early May to October at the latest to grow any plants. So watermelons are difficult, things like that. So when you think about a potato that could take anywhere between 70 to 110 days to harvest, depending on your variety, that's a lot of real estate being taken up in your bed. So you want to think about container gardening. You have room to succession plant other crops instead of a potato. So when you do it in a container, you can just easily harvest that. You're not disturbing your soil, and you can move it around, and you don't have that real estate being taken up in one of your either raised beds or area of your garden. So that's why potatoes in containers are becoming more and more popular. Now this container, like I said, I found at Target really cool. It actually gives a person instructions right there on the back. It says start with adding your soil, put in a potato that's sprouting, continue to cover the roots up as it grows, and then voila, you're ready to harvest. You just lift up the first bucket as I showed you earlier and harvest. Now, that's not what most professional gardeners would tell you how to container garden, those instructions, so I'm going to tell you a little bit different. So what they recommend is actually they give you this line in the soil here, or in the actual tray. Let me see if you guys can see that on camera. They give you this lip. They want you to raise that soil level to begin right up to that lip and then plant your potatoes. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to keep my soil level, as you can see, about 3/4 of the way up. So you can see almost inside here, there's going to be this little actual lip here where that's where it separates and you're actually harvest your potatoes. That's where we're going to start our planting. So a good 1/2 inch down further from where their recommendations are. So let me finish getting the soil level filled up to there, and we'll get our potatoes in there. So I've got my soil level right there where I want it. I'm just using a simple potting soil for mine, and because it is a lighter, fluffier soil that'll hold moisture. And I've got it on hand, so that's what I'm going to be using. What's next? So for what you want to do now is take your potatoes, right? Now these are a simple golden potato, golden variety potato that is store-bought that I'm going to be using. And what you want to look for is those eyes. Those eyes need to be planted face up. Now, I'm going to be doing 2 different types in here, so I'm going to set one off to one side, and then I'm going to use this other red potato variety that I got from the store as well, and it's kind of starting to get a little shriveled there. And any eyes that are going to be on the bottom of the potato or on the sides, I'm just going to peel off and just get the ones that I want on the top. I'm going to go ahead and plant that in the dirt, so when you do it, it's going to look a little bit like that, right? So you just want it kind of half buried in the dirt. All right, so before we fill this up, what we want to talk about is, now that we've got those potatoes just set in there about halfway, now is the time for fertilizer. So potatoes are very heavy feeders. What that means is they need a lot of nutrients, right? So they are, because they're a root crop, they're so heavy feeders, you need some very heavy fertilizers. A lot of companies will recommend a 10-10-10 fertilizer for that. A lot of people like to use fish and bone as a fertilizer and things like that, but what you can actually get is a fertilizer right on the bag, says 10-10-10. That stands for nitrates, phosphates, and potash or potassium, right? So that's what those 3 10s are stand for. So you sprinkle it right on top of the potatoes, so that way when the roots start forming, it's already right there, And you also want to sprinkle in compost if you have it. If you don't have it, a good potting soil or a good loose soil, compost absolutely being the best. But for me, I'm actually going to be, my fertilizer is going to be different. I'm not fertilizing with your traditional fertilizers. I fertilize with aquarium water, used aquarium water. Most people don't realize that used pond or aquarium water is full of nitrates and phosphates. So absolutely excellent for them. The only thing missing is potash, which I can actually get from burning wood and waiting for it to cool and putting that potash in mixing that in my soil. So I utilize fertilizers that way. If you don't have access to any of that, make sure you're picking up a good fertilizer. This is the most important step to getting your potatoes off to a great start. And so as you saw in the instructions on the side, it wants you to bury this and then let it grow. What we're going to do now at this point is just go ahead and fill it right up to the top. With container gardening, there's no reason to mound it up because there's not a lot of room to mound it after it pokes through. So you just want to go ahead and backfill at this point and bury it completely. Because that way when the potatoes actually do poke through, you can always throw a mulch layer over the top if necessary, but you're probably going to be, since this is a smaller thing, your leaves are going to cover this, shade out that area for you, and you won't have as many problems with that. So we're just going to backfill this one in and water it real nicely. And let's talk a little bit more about harvesting. So now that we know how to plant a potato and the different ways you can plant potatoes and some different ideas on that, let's talk about some actual problems that pop up along the way when your potatoes are already growing. So we already mentioned one in this video, which is potato bugs. These little nasty things that absolutely destroy a potato crop. They eat the leaves, which is where all the energy from the sun comes from, and they're little nasty buggers. You want to treat them with neem oil whenever possible and try to get them away from your crop as much as possible. So be checking your potatoes regularly, your leaves, making sure you don't have any potato bugs. You don't want your potatoes to dry out. Your potatoes they love moisture, but they want a well-draining soil. So you want to make sure that you're keeping them watered heavily. In wetter areas, you can get away with not watering them, but everywhere else, you should be watering them a minimum of once a week. So just be cautious with that. Because they are such heavy root developing tubers, they do need lots of water. Now, another thing that you want to worry about is if a potato itself, the actual potato, once they start growing, it gets exposed and starts showing above ground, what's going to happen is the sun's going to hit that potato. It's going to turn green. Once it turns green, that part of the potato is actually not safe to eat. It will actually make you sick. So you can still cut that part of the potato off and the rest of the potato is perfectly fine, but a lot of people just throw that particular potato away. So that's why people hill or mound their potatoes, or make sure they cover it with a thick mulch. So you want to be careful to keep an eye on that. The leaves should shade your plant enough if they're crowded enough, which is perfectly fine that potatoes are crowded. It will either result in smaller potatoes, right? Or spacing them out could result in bigger potatoes. But again, it all depends on the variety of crop you're actually growing. In that container, I could grow 4 different plants very easily, even though it's a smaller container, because I'm simply just growing these small versions of these potatoes. Now, keep in mind, these could get to be very large potatoes depending on how well they're fertilized, how well the plant's doing, so on and so forth. So another huge problem that you're looking for is something called potato blight. So I'll try to put a picture of it here for you. Potato blight, very similar to like a tomato blight, is very yellowing of the leaves, spotty, brown. It can really kill your plant, and that blight can actually spread to other plants around it. So you have 2 options at this point when it comes to potato blight. You can actually try to treat it with some herbicides, things like that, and treat that actual plant. a lot of times it's usually best to just cut your losses and actually harvest that plant or harvest that whole row of crops just to get rid of it. And you could still eat the potatoes. They're perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. So whatever potatoes have grown up into that point, you can go ahead and harvest them out and eat them whatever size they are. That's the great thing about potatoes. There's nothing better than a homegrown potato. It's so much better than and juicier and softer than a store-bought potato. So you want to go ahead and either harvest those out at that point or treat it with some herbicides if it's early in the plant, and try to actually correct that. Cut off the leaves, so on and so forth, and try to get that corrected right away. Again, another great thing about container planting your potatoes, because now you can move that one away from your other crops and just cut your losses and or try to save that one individual without worrying about that blight spreading to other plants. Now that we've talked about some of the most common diseases, some of the common issues that come along with the potatoes, let's talk about how do you know when your potatoes are ready to harvest, right? That's the best part. That's the part everybody wants to know, right? So really there's a couple of different ways. Number one, each variety of potato, as I mentioned earlier on the video, actually has a certain life cycle. So it's important to look up to know the variety of potato that you actually have. Look it up on Google to find out what the actual harvest time is, or wherever you bought it from, whether you bought it from a seed company, you bought it from a big box store, so on and so forth. It should tell you, if you bought seed potatoes, the length of time to harvest, and you should track that. So like today is April 19th. I believe this variety is 80 days. I have to double check that personally. And then, so I mark my calendar 80 days from now to go ahead and harvest. I can harvest early on these if I wanted to, but it's just a good thing all around to know. Now, the other way that you can tell is once the leaves themselves actually start dying back or turning yellow. If they've been thriving for quite some time and then they start dying back and starting to kind of turn yellow, it's very slightly different than like blight, so you have to be careful what you're watching for, but that's a good sign that your potatoes are ready to be harvested. That's the plant telling you it's done with its life cycle. Now, some varieties, not all, some varieties of potatoes will actually flower and grow berries. These berries are not safe to eat, so keep them away from your animals and don't eat them yourself, right? But that means the potatoes themselves are ready to be harvested. So there you have it, folks. I hope you guys learned something. If you have any success or have some trouble growing potatoes, throw your comments down below. I'd love to hear from you. What's your favorite variety of potatoes? There's fingerling potatoes. There's some pink potatoes with white spots. There's so many varieties of potatoes out there. And one little potato like this can yield 5 to 10 pounds. So it's just a superfood that's so easy to grow, as you can see. You plant a potato, you can even save that potato in a dark storage cupboard for next year, let it chit, right, and then plant it in the ground in the spring. I mean, absolutely amazing that you can get that many pounds of potatoes out of one crop. So awesome, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I like shooting it. Leave a comment, leave a like, subscribe if you're not already, and I hope you guys are staying safe and enjoying your gardens. Thanks for watching.